Good evening and welcome to the new BUGAJSKI Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK in Kosovo. Today I will be discussing the role of some vital international security questions with our guest on the BUGAJSKI hot seat, Margarita Assenova from the prestigious Washington-based Jamestown Foundation. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Moscow's War on Washington. US intelligence officials are near certain that Russian services have hacked US Democratic Party emails as well as election registration websites. Moscow's cyber theft is part of an expanding offensive against Western governments and institutions designed to delegitimize and disarm its key adversaries, and its primary target is Washington. The overarching objective of President Vladimir Putin in his foreign policy is to restore Russia as a great power. To achieve this ambition, the predominance of the United States, particularly in Europe and Eurasia, must be reversed, but not by outright war, but through a campaign of penetration and subversion. Diverse methods of disinformation are employed by Moscow to undermine Washington's international influence, whether through the traditional or the social media. Western politicians who question NATO's rationale, who cast doubts on the defense of new allies, or acquiesce to a Russian sphere of influence, are supported. Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump needs to be mindful that any perceived weakening of NATO simply whets the Kremlin's neo-imperial appetite and could lead to violent regional conflicts. America is also charged with pursuing democratic messianism, in which Western liberal values are forced upon states such as Russia. And here, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is one of the chief culprits, because she has regularly criticized Russia's falsified elections. An assortment of political parties, movements, and influential individuals in the West are courted and supported by Kremlin-connected organizations. Moscow seeks to benefit from anti-establishment sentiments, whether among ultra-leftists, radical rightists, or militant populists. But where Moscow cannot influence the policies of Western governments, it seeks to disrupt their activities and minimize their impact. Security services have developed cyberspace warfare to undermine Western targets, including systematic assaults and denial of service attacks on government sites. Hence, the hacking of Democratic Party emails and releasing controversial texts is meant to sow confusion and conflict. The purpose is to expose the United States as an allegedly failing or fake democracy in which elections are bought or rigged. The Kremlin can thereby undermine the legitimacy and credibility of the next US administration, especially if Clinton prevails as the next president. Moscow's multiple objectives are to weaken the legitimacy of the American system, undermine US foreign policy, disqualify America's human rights campaigns, and foster US isolationism through Washington's political disengagement and military withdrawal. Candidate Trump seems to be unaware that he is falling into Putin's trap and unwittingly weakening America's global position. By negatively comparing democratically elected US President Barack Obama with the Kremlin autocrat, who Trump considers, by the way, to be a great leader, he is also legitimizing a corrupt and expansionist dictatorship. It is time again for the BUGAJSKI hot seat with our special guest today, Margarita Assenova, Director of Programs at the prestigious Washington-based Jamestown Foundation, and as it happens, co-author of our landmark new book entitled Eurasian Disunion, Russia's Vulnerable Flanks. And today we're going to discuss the book, but not only the content of the book, but the importance of the book in the current context, particularly in the terms of US elections, in terms of Putin's foreign policy and so forth. So thank you, Margarita, for joining me on the show. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And
Thank you for having me.
I'm sure our guests, our audience in Pristina in particular, will enjoy your presence here. To begin with, and I always ask guests I have here in Washington, could you give us a sort of summary of what the Jamestown Foundation is, what it does, its importance in Washington, its role in American politics and so forth?
The Jamestown Foundation is not particularly a foundation in the common sense of the word, similar to Clinton Foundation or Trump Foundation or any other foundation that is grant-giving foundation. This is a non-governmental organization. It falls into the category of charities, as most of the non-governmental organizations in Washington do. The purpose of Jamestown Foundation is to do analysis of foreign policy. It covers Eurasia, it covers China, terrorism, and it has a particularly interesting publication called Militant Leadership Monitor, which monitors all the major figures involved in the militant movements around the world. The China Brief is a publication that comes out twice a month. It has a major conference once a year on China. The same is with the terrorism program. There is a major conference once a year. The Eurasia is covered, the Eurasia region is covered by the Jamestown flagship publication called Eurasia Daily Monitor. It covers developments throughout the region, former Soviet Union states that are now Central Asia, South Caucasus, the Baltics, and Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, as well as some of the countries that are on the flanks of Eurasia, such as the Balkans, such as Central and Eastern Europe, covers particularly energy. This is a very interesting and very good analysis on energy politics and energy geopolitics of Europe.
Thank you very much. Well, let's turn to Russia. It struck me during the course of these elections, during the past few months, that Russia's probably featured more prominently than I remember since Reagan's time, since the time of President Ronald Reagan in our elections. Usually foreign policy is a secondary issue. Even in terms of foreign policy, Russia's way down the list. We often focus on international terrorism, on Middle East and North Korea and so forth. But suddenly Russia's featured very prominently in the US elections, primarily because of these cyber attacks or cyber hacks of the Democratic Party, US Democratic Party. Could you give us a little bit of a sense of why it is that both candidates are now so heavily talking about Russia and Russia's role in America's elections?
Some 15 years ago, Russia was spoken with enthusiasm about the end of the Cold War, the cooperation between the two countries, particularly on nuclear disarmament, and there was significant success achieved at that time. So Russia was no longer considered an enemy. It was no longer considered a foe. It was a partner, as many partners in Europe, that the United States was now cooperating. But that changed. It changed with Putin's rise to power. It changed with his idea of building a great power, making Russia again a great power. He considers the dissolution of the Soviet Union as the greatest failure of the 20th century for Russia. So he put his energy in restoring this great state, although this is no longer Soviet Union and nothing to do with the Soviet Union, but a very prominently featured country in international politics on the international space. It changed particularly after the aggression in Ukraine. The annexation of Crimea, the war in eastern Ukraine, it had very prominent impact on American politics, American views of Russia. So now Russia is no longer seen as a partner to cooperate with. Russia is seen with suspicion. Russia is under sanctions for the intervention in Ukraine, and Putin is gearing his officers of all kinds, not only military but also informational diplomats and so on, to undermine the American democratic process as well. Interference in American elections, this is happening for the first time in history. There has been spying, there has been diplomatic pressure, there have been all kinds of intelligence operations going on by Russia and other countries in the United States, and by the United States in other countries too. But there has never been a direct intervention into the election process. The hacks into the Democratic National Committee servers is one part of it. But the more dangerous part is the hacking of electoral database in 2 states of the United States. That means stealing data, potentially impacting or influencing or committing fraud in the election results. The dangers are very significant. What was noticed was the attack on the Democratic Party and its structures, on Clinton's campaign and her supporters, not on the Republican campaign, not on Donald Trump campaign. So that tells us a lot, that Putin has preference here and has a stake in American elections, and he clearly prefers Donald Trump. Donald Trump praised Putin on more than one occasion. Donald Trump doesn't seem to be aware of international politics, doesn't have to have a sharp sense of how the world works, and that's very, very beneficial for Mr. Putin. This is a very easy way to manipulate Donald Trump as potential president to deliver to what Mr. Putin wants.
So are the Kremlin's objectives to disqualify Clinton by leaking certain emails that show her or her party in a bad light? Or is it to much more, let's say, comprehensively disqualify the American system of elections?
I think it's both. By disqualifying, undermining American democracy, what America is most proud of, is directly intervening in the social structure of a great society. And this is by itself could be a big victory for Putin if he is successful. But at the same time, disqualifying Clinton as presidential candidate and undermining her as a potential president of the United States is the other objective. So there are 2 objectives here. Putin does not have interest of America being strong, of the European Union being strong, and being strong based on democracy. They want this process undermined, and they want people to doubt the validity of elections, the fairness of elections. They want people to doubt their own system. But disqualifying Clinton is another part of the story. Putin is afraid of Clinton, and this is why he wants to disqualify her. Clinton was the only politician who stood up to Putin, and she told him in his face that he's building another Soviet Union. She is seeing through Putin and through his schemes in Ukraine and other places. She's very popular in Eurasia. She's extremely popular in Central Asia, in the South Caucasus, in Belarus, in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe. She managed to build those connections both as a first lady, as advocate for women's rights, and later on as Secretary of State. She did not neglect the region. While Obama policy has not always been focused on our part of the world, Eastern Europe, Russia, Eurasia, as much as on Middle East and Asia, Clinton has never taken her eyes off the region, realizing, understanding that Europe is the greatest ally of the United States, and this alliance must be preserved. By undermining Clinton, Putin wants to undermine the transatlantic alliance.
But don't you think this may have the reverse effect? In other words, a reaction by the American public against Russian interference would be to favor the candidate that Russia does not favor.
I do expect that by a lot of well-educated people in this country. I am not sure how much this is understood in parts and pockets of the country that have been impacted by recession, have been impacted by job loss, that staunch supporters of Trump for different reasons. They don't see foreign policy as a major issue. Most of America, the Americans don't see foreign policy as a major issue in their ways of voting, how they are going to vote.
Or they see it in very simplified forms.
Most of the American population is kind of following the line that Trump found, and is winning on this line, that America first, we need to take care of our country first, we don't need to be involved in the world. we need to leave our allies to pay their way for their security. And that resonates with the Americans. There has been a long tradition of isolationism. We have to remember World War II and how America got involved. Before that involvement, there was no support by the public for the United States to get involved in World War II. So this is a long-standing tradition on which Trump is building his campaign. But they're also very well-educated people in this country. And I want to quote one statistic. 35% of the American people who graduate from high school go on to continue their education in a college, 2-year college, 4-year college, a master's degree and PhD. So this is a highly educated segment of the society, which is pretty large. And these are the independent voters that both candidates are trying to win.
Paradoxically, people don't remember, but when George W. Bush came to power, he was talking about more of a withdrawal from the world, a lessened American role, particularly after the interventions that Clinton had in Yugoslavia and against Serbia over Kosovo. And what happened? 9/11, and suddenly international affairs became most important. Let me ask you another question, or
Can
actually...
I jump on this
Yeah,
first?
please.
Oh, when I was at Stanford University for a program called John Knight Fellowship in Journalism, in professional journalism, Condoleezza Rice was provost of Stanford at that time, and other officials were also professors. And what she was talking about is two things. We cannot be, it was 1997, just before the intervention in Kosovo. She was saying America cannot be the policeman of the world, and the second mantra was we cannot do nation building. At the same time, the events in Kosovo were showing that there was going to be a major crisis, and nobody was seeing this from in the place that I was. A student started a campaign in support of Kosovo students. And this is how the issue was raised, and this is how it got to the attention of many professors, and this is how it was raised in Washington later on by people understanding what was going to happen in Kosovo. So when the intervention happened, there was already a very big support build for this to happen. It was, of course, a different time. It was under Clinton, but in any event, later on, with these two major lines that were not intervening in foreign countries, we cannot be the policeman of the world. 9/11 happened, and we had to.
Right, back to the present time. One of Trump's campaign slogans, the biggest campaign slogan, is "Let's make America great again." What he means by that, one can argue. Clearly, Putin is intent on making Russia great again, but in his case, at the expense of neighbors, at the cost of Western unity. Will he be successful?
What Trump means is making America
I don't mean
great
Trump.
again.
Will Putin
by,
be successful?
Yeah, I understand. What Trump means by making America great again is through isolationism, through cutting off or reducing connections with the global world and reducing trade. What Putin means by making Russia great again is through expansionism, through control over territories on its flanks, on Russia's flanks, through control over the European Union, over gas pipelines, over American politics. So there is a very big difference between what these two people mean by making their countries great again. Will Putin be successful? Well, unlike Trump, Putin has a strategy. And that's a very well-developed strategy that he has been implementing for the last 10 years, maybe, since he came to power, and especially since 2008, when he really pushed for Russia to take its deserved, according to him, place in the world.
And the intervention in Georgia.
Yes. That strategy was is based on several main components, and I always stress, and we actually stress in the book, that this is not a one-off thing. It's not by chance. There is nothing opportunistic in this strategy. The strategy is well developed to put Russia as high as possible on the international arena, so that its word is taken seriously when Moscow wants something. At the same time, the means of implementation of this strategy are depending on opportunity, on chances, on particular developments in different countries.
So, will he be successful? Will he create a new Russian empire and carve this out of Eurasia and Europe?
Well, one thing is to want, another thing to be able to do it, and the third thing to really make it possible. I think that while Putin is trying to build a great Russia, he's digging the grave of Russia. The Russia he wants to build is depleted of funds. The funds that are available are going for nuclear arms. They're going for armament in general.
Right.
The society is deprived of means of survival and is becoming more disillusioned. He is mobilizing this society through one tool only, called nationalism and anti-Westernism. And it's successful so far. But when people really become very poor and starving and suffering, I'm not sure what is going to happen in Russia. In my opinion, in our opinion, in the book we take this stand, Russia is going to disintegrate sooner or later because it's not possible to survive the pressures that Russia and Russian society is put under. And when Russia disintegrates, it's not going to be like the disintegration of the Soviet Union, which was non-violent, an empire falling in a non-violent way. This is going to be in a very connected world through global communication ways, and it's going to be very violent for the Russian society, and unfortunately not only, for the neighbors as well.
And at the same time, Russia is generating instability in neighboring countries through its ambitions, through its attempts to recreate some sort of Eurasian empire, and damaging the prospects of various countries in democracy building, in stabilization, state integrity, international integration, and so forth. And we go through quite rigorously, I think, in the volume looking at these. I'll come to that in a second, but let me ask you about how Moscow views the American role in Europe. Why is America such an obstacle to Russia in achieving its ambitions?
Because of NATO. America is the pillar of NATO. This is the country with the biggest contribution to the collective power of NATO. As arms, as soldiers, as military forces, as capabilities, there is no doubt about it. Undermining America in Europe means undermining America in NATO. And without America, NATO is going to be very, very limited in its military capabilities. This is why Putin is undermining the transatlantic relationship.
So NATO, as we argue in the book, isn't so much a threat to Russia, to Russia's stability, to Russian security, but it's a threat to the Russian threat. In other words, countries that join NATO feel they are protected under Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, as well as other articles, and therefore feel more secure. And one of the policies of Putin is not to make countries feel secure, but to feel unstable.
Well, that's the goal. If the countries around Russia are protected, Russia would have a lot less room to maneuver. If Georgia was a member of NATO, probably the 2008 annexation, taking over a pronouncement of independence of two territories of Georgia would not have happened. Russia would not have intervened in Georgia because the Article 5 would have protected Georgia. And this is enough deterrence for Russia not to send their tanks into Georgian territory. If Ukraine was member of NATO, there would have been a very serious consideration whether or not to interfere and take over Crimea and send troops and ammunition and soldiers to eastern Ukraine. So by protecting these countries, by having them covered, like the Baltics are covered by NATO at the moment, Russia is limited in its means of control of its flanks.
So presumably statements that we've heard from Donald Trump that NATO is obsolete, that countries aren't paying their way, question the commitment of US to defending the sovereignty and integrity and security of these countries play into Putin's hands?
Absolutely. This is what Putin wants. Somebody who would go back to isolationism, undermine the NATO alliance, and that is going to untie Putin's hands to control Europe.
In terms of the Article 5 guarantee, which is the Musketeer principle, all for one for all, it's come under some question, of course, during the past year, particularly with studies that have been issued by some American institutions that Russia could be in Tallinn, you know, capital of Estonia, or Riga, capital of Latvia, in a matter of hours without a NATO response. Is what NATO doing sufficient to counter Russian threats against these frontline states, in the Baltic states in particular?
I think it's a very serious build-up in the Baltic Sea by NATO at the moment that would be sufficient to interfere to prevent such taking over of any of the Baltic's capitals. This is why Trump campaign statements like Gingrich statement that Estonia is a suburb of St. Petersburg, and why should we care about Estonia if they're not paying their dues to security? Not only uninformed, they're extremely dangerous. First of all, Estonia is one of the countries that does contribute 2% of its budget to armament, to its own armament, to its own military forces. So it meets the requirement that NATO puts towards any country, every country. Secondly, any interference in the Baltic countries is going to challenge NATO. How is NATO going to respond? Well, Putin might want to create a provocation just to test the readiness of NATO to defend these countries. This is why NATO needs to be ready to react swiftly, to react very quickly, and to prevent the very first attempt of challenging NATO territory. If that's successful, Putin is going to withdraw, because Putin's strategy, as well developed as it is a strategy of somebody who is used to bullying the countries around its allies, its neighbors, its foes. This is a strategy of a bully. A bully withdraws when a bully is faced with determined resistance.
One of the findings of our book is that if Russia cannot bring a country into its sphere of influence, such as the Eurasian Economic Union or the Collective Security Treaty Organization or other multinational formats that are controlled by the Kremlin, its second approach is to prevent those countries from moving westwards, from moving into Western institutions. And one of the things I'm most proud of that we did is in our first chapter, in a section entitled Arsenal of Subversion, we list the 68 specific tools that the Kremlin applies, tools of subversion that the Kremlin has applied against targeted countries along its borders. Can you outline for us how we have classified these tools? What are the main categories that these tools, I don't want you to list 68 tools, but the categories they fall into?
The main categories that these tools are divided into are, first of all, international, in which we have included diplomatic tools, the leverage Russia is trying to gain on the international arena, and all these tools and all these moves that we see in the news every day. Those are very well known ways of subversion through diplomatic tools, through international domination, through international organizations, through the United Nations. We see what is the debate now about who is going to chair the United Nations and how Russia is ready to put its veto and select a candidate that is going to be more friendly and more willing to do what Russia wants. Domination in the international organization is a very big part of the game. But then there are the informational tools, and this is the cyber attacks, and this is the informational disinformation, as we call it sometimes. Yes, the informational disinformation. that means a news is presented, and it looks like news. It is presented as news, but the news contains disinformation. And this is what Russia today, television, RT television does on a daily basis in every country. Only a trained eye of a good journalist and a policy analyst and a foreign policy official who knows the facts can see between the lines and what exactly was twisted among everything that looks like perfect information, what is twisted to change the perception, to change people's opinion. This penetration of NGOs, of non-governmental organizations in different countries in order to subvert them and to promote Russian cause in the South Caucasus, for example, and other countries, the main tool is Eurasia. It's Eurasian Union promoting organizations or organizations that promote anti-Western sentiment, because by reducing the anti-Western sentiment, increasing the anti-Western sentiment in Georgia, Russia is going to achieve a big landmark for itself. Georgia is incredibly pro-Western, and this is what keeps Georgia as ally of many of Europe and the United States. If that sentiment is reduced, Russia has achieved its goal. In the book, there are more tools in more detail listed, but the categories are political as well. The political pressure on governments. For example, political corruption. Russia is the king of spreading political corruption in every country in the Balkans. Where Russia has any influence, this is the most used tool by Russia. Penetrating the elites, paying the elites, involving them in energy lobbies, in energy interests, so that they are following Russian interests, paying them for that. One little fact I want to mention: for example, the officials of the National Electric Energy Company of Bulgaria, who participated in the South Stream joint venture with Russia, were paid 7 times higher salaries that they receive at their own organization. This is corruption par excellence. And this is how Russia builds loyalties in different countries. Then the economic tools. Recently, a Russian member of parliament declared that Russia has bought already half of Bulgaria. It's ready to buy the rest. But that's not the case of Bulgaria only. I'm giving this example only because it's recent. The same is happening in Serbia. Serbia is penetrated to such a large extent through military, the armament sector, the military sector, the selling of arms and acquiring assets in the defense industry, to energy industry. NIS is a NIS was bought by Gazprom, so NIS is a Russian organization now, energy organization. That's the largest in Serbia. The same is attempts in Croatia, attempts in Montenegro, attempts in other countries in the region. It's not one country or another. The interesting thing that one can notice is the less influence Russia has in one country. Poland, Romania, Kosovo, Albania, the less influence among the population and in politics Russia has, the better the chances for economic development, for recovery, and for prosperity. So the pace of economic development is faster, and because the country is following an independent course that's not penetrated by Russian corrupt interests. Then we have the social tools, then we have the ethnic groups that are being used, and here we have put not only Russian nationals or Russian passport holders or Russian speakers. Here we put ethnic groups and ethnic tensions in different countries that Russia exploits to achieve its goals.
Such as the Serbian minority in Kosovo.
Exactly. Serbian minority in Kosovo, Republika Srpska in Bosnia, where Russia has, Moscow has significant economic interest, is being penetrated by Russian interests, is being pulled away from the federation and from the entire establishment called Bosnia and Herzegovina in order to sabotage the development of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
And you could multiply that throughout the region. from Moldova to Estonia, all the way to the Caucasus, all the way to Central Asia.
Moldova is a captured state by somebody who made his money in Russia. The same happened in Georgia several years ago when Ivanishvili came to power. A Russian-based Georgian businessman who, through his money and political connections, became, using, of course, the frustration of the people with Saakashvili's government politics in the last several years. He came to power and turned Georgia into more Russia-friendly state, with even Gazprom trying to come back and buy assets and deliver gas to Georgia again, several years after Georgia became independent, by delivering gas from Azerbaijan. And we'll talk about energy too, but energy is a big part of these politics.
We outline the book, in fact the subtitle of the book is Russia's Vulnerable Flanks. In other words, we look at 5 main regions that Russia in a way has subdivided its attention towards. Could you outline those for us and give us a taste of which country within those regions is most targeted, most vulnerable?
We have divided the flanks into 5 flanks, and starting from the north, we included the Nordic countries and the Baltic countries. And here we have not only the 3 Baltic countries, we have also Finland, we have also Sweden. The countries along the Baltic Sea are important to look into Russia's attempts to subvert them in one way or another. And here the threat is mostly military, through the Baltic Sea, because the Baltic Sea has become a NATO lake. There are 5 NATO countries, member countries there. It's a very significant presence of NATO. It's a little difficult for Russia to penetrate, but Russia is challenging NATO presence in the Baltic Sea through these countries and through different interventions within those countries. Russia is using the Russian minority in Latvia and in Estonia.
Yeah.
Russia is using, and it's become a question that wasn't on the agenda, wasn't in the news for years. Now it's become more pronounced. So the Russian population there is demanding more and stirred by all this Russian nationalism, something that was going pretty well since those countries became members of both the European Union and NATO. Then further down, we have Central Europe and the countries between, from the Black Sea from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. We have Belarus, Ukraine. We have Central and Eastern Europe, Romania. We have Slovakia and Poland and Czech Republic. Then we come to the Balkans, where Romania is included, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Western Balkans. This is another flank. And the other 2 flanks are the Caucasus, the 3 countries in the Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, and the 5 countries in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. So where are the vulnerabilities? In our opinion, in our assessment, the main vulnerabilities are around the Black Sea. The Black Sea is the soft belly of defense of the European Union and NATO, because Russia has managed to capture territories from Crimea in Ukraine to Abkhazia in Georgia, and that's one continuous line of territory to Transnistria and Moldova. This is the projection, and from that pronounced peninsula of Crimea, Russian projection of power goes all the way to Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, and Mediterranean. Romania de facto borders Russia now in the Black Sea. That was not the case before. Romania has a neighbor called Moldova and another neighbor called Ukraine. And when Ukraine was in charge of its entire territory, these were the territorial waters of these 2 countries, were borders of Romania. Now Russia, through Crimea, because it's become like shrinking of territorial waters, Russia is a neighbor of Romania, of NATO. And this is very, very important. But Romania has been less subjected to Russian influence simply because Romania resisted the most, while Bulgaria is one of the most susceptible countries to Russian influence, and we can see that it's impacting politics, it's impacting economics, it's impacting energy. And from Bulgaria, this projection goes throughout the Western Balkans as well. So this is the vulnerable area where Russia is concentrating new ships, new military ships with nuclear missiles, where Russia is concentrating a lot of manpower as security forces, where Russia is projecting more power onto Georgia and putting pressure on Turkey. Turkey is squeezed between Russia and Syria now, and it's actually in a very, very bad place, considering the internal developments with the attempted coup. This is one big danger for the entire region.
So how is, in this schema, how is Kosovo affected by Russian subversion? Is it affected directly or indirectly?
Kosovo is affected, of course, because its neighbors are affected. And because the Serbian minority is constantly used to be stirred and to create problems for Pristina. But Kosovo is affected by Russian influence in Macedonia, by Russian influence in Bulgaria, and a huge Russian influence in Serbia. Kosovo is affected not only in terms of recognition, but there won't be agreement between Serbia and Kosovo for as long as Russia has a say in Belgrade. This is how Russia is affecting Kosovo.
Right. There's also the disinformation aspect of how Russia depicts Albanians in general and Kosovars in particular.
Absolutely. Russia depicts the Albanians in a negative light, uses any kind of negative news to spread around, and that is reflecting on the neighboring countries. The mass propaganda goes to Serbia, and that propaganda creates public negativity against Kosovo Albanians and public negativity against Macedonian Albanians.
Right.
It's not only Kosovo Albanians, against the Albanians in general. Considering itself the representative of the civilization, the Christian civilization, and depicting Kosovo Albanians and Macedonian Albanians and Albanians in Albania as Muslim enemies of the Christians, of Orthodox Christians. This is how Russia tries to create divisions in the region.
Now, talk about divisions. One important aspect we look at in the book is also Russian policy towards the West and towards Europe in particular. Russia favors, let's say, a disunited European Union, a split European Union. It supported Brexit. Why is the EU such a threat to Russia?
The EU is a way of providing and supporting stability and prosperity for its members and its neighborhood. Not only its neighbors. Because Kosovo is within the neighborhood, more stability and prosperity in the Balkans, more stability and prosperity is going to be in Kosovo. The European Union is working with Kosovo, with Bosnia and Herzegovina, with Albania, to build democratic institutions and have a reliable electoral process and have a solid, strong democratic institution. This is key. Russia does not want that. Democratic institutions are not easy to penetrate. When you have instability, when you have unclear political rules, it's much easier for Russian interests to penetrate the country and to control the country. The European Union is a strong European Union is going to provide what we all expected from the European Union to provide: future. A weak European Union is going to be unable to do that. That's why Russia actually increased the bombing campaign in Syria to send more refugees to Europe, to flood Europe with refugees and create more instability. This is why Russian sources are supporting right-wing parties in many European states, starting from France and ending in Hungary, in order to destabilize the democratic process, to delegitimize the democratic process of these countries and make them less stable, to create a sentiment of resentment of Brussels and the mechanism of controls of the European Union, which are pretty it's a pretty decentralized organization, frankly. Just the rules are valid for all countries, and these rules are not in Russia's favor. It's not in Russia's favor to follow the third energy package on energy that European Union has introduced and is promoting for the last several years. Because that means that Russia cannot build pipelines throughout Europe that it owns at the same time, and owns the gas that is going through those pipelines, and creates complete monopoly of the energy sources and the transportation of energy sources. European Union says no, the pipeline should be owned by somebody else, not the producer that is, and not the person, the organization that is selling the gas. And there has to be rules. There should be reserved capacity for other sources. We can't have exclusive pipelines in Europe. No. We need to have pipelines that transmit gas in a gas market that is becoming globalized and that is becoming very integrated. So gas that is delivered to England could be delivered in Kosovo without necessarily having physically transmitted this gas to Kosovo.
So this is one of the...
It's a swap operation.
Right, exactly. So this is one of the main reasons for Russia's attack on Ukraine, because Ukraine was moving closer to the European Union. It was on the verge of signing this comprehensive association agreement. The fear in Russia, if Ukraine becomes successful, as a successful country, it will project that success to other neighbors who will reject the Russian model.
The main danger to Russia is to have strong, democratic, prosperous neighbor in the face of Ukraine in particular. This is a huge country. It's a very big country, and Russia is claiming it's part of its heritage, and the Russian identity started there. Absolutely wrong. Ukrainian identity is specific, very different from Russian identity. Ukrainian Orthodoxy started in 833, in 888, and it was actually with the Bulgarian patriarch, and with the books translated in Bulgaria into Church Slavonic, that Russians are calling it now, had nothing to do with Moscow. It had much more to do with Byzantine and with Bulgaria than with Moscow. So claiming that heritage by Russia was as appalling as anything else. But it's a huge country, and Russia wants to have full control over this country with its natural resources, with its huge population, and with the Black Sea, the access to the Black Sea, which is key. So all the pipelines that are going through Ukraine, Russia wanted to stop transmission of gas through Ukraine as a way of punishment and as a way of denying transit fee to the Ukrainian government.
Margarita, we've come to the end of the slot that we have. I wish we had more time. I have many, many more questions or many points for discussion. Maybe we'll come back to this, because I don't think Russia's going to drop out of the picture. I think far from it, as conditions, as you mentioned, deteriorate in Russia, economic, political, social. We may witness power struggles, conflicts between the regions and the center, conflicts in the regions themselves, which are now being starved of resources from the center, from the federal budget. So Russia isn't going to disappear there. It's also not going to disappear internationally, because I always think that the more problems they have at home, the more they create problems abroad. It distracts public attention, it mobilizes people to the foreign enemy. And I think we're going to see some interesting debates. Debates are coming up between Trump and Clinton, as you know, in our election campaign. I think we're going to see Russia come up in this in a very interesting way, in terms of Trump's contacts with Russia, in terms of how Putin views Clinton. And the back and forth there, I think, is going to be fascinating, and I hope the American public is watching. Very last word, I want to give the book another plug.
A very last word is the European governments, whether they are members of the European Union or not, they need to be aware of what Russia is doing and have a strategy to counter these attempts of influence. One of the strategies to counter the energy influence is to support the Southern Gas Corridor, gas coming from the Caspian, from Azerbaijan, through Turkey and to the Balkans. This can make the Balkans entirely independent, even if half of the 10 billion cubic meters of gas that are coming now from Russia are replaced with gas from Azerbaijan, the Balkans are going to regain its political and energy independence. And the other thing I wanted to say, if we look at Central Asia, which is incredibly dependent on Russia, we see now the increased influence of China. So Russian influence is not forgiven, it's not forever, but we need to know how to counter the damaging strategies.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much. And here's the book again for those of you that cannot purchase it in hard copy. It's available on Jamestown Foundation website as PDF. Thank you, and Margarita, thank you very much for joining me. And
Thank you.
We'll have you back, I'm sure, at a future date. Thank you. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at RTK and here at VOA. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Mira Pavshim.